Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be doing a Sharks prospect update for the 21-22 season. It's been a few months since my last Sharks prospect update, and we are now a few months into many of the junior seasons. Most players have played a decent handful of games, usually a couple of dozen. We're getting to some Christmas breaks here, so why not have the perfect time to take a look at how some of these players are doing? This is also right before the World Junior Tournament gets underway. Now, you'll notice a couple of things about this list is that all of these players were Sharks players drafted over these past 2 years, so either the 2020 entry draft or the 2021 entry draft, and as such, there are no players who are currently with, let's say, the San Jose Barracuda, who I'm going to be giving an update on. The reason being is that the players on the San Jose Barracuda I feel as though most fans are able to get at least somewhat easy access to those stats and will be able to update themselves on that because, of course, the San Jose Barracuda players are still under the San Jose organization umbrella. I mean, they literally share the same city they play in. They share the same name, San Jose. So it's quite easy to check up on how players like Shemalevsky, Merkley, or Reedy are doing compared to on the junior side where, yeah, you could obviously find resources online of where each of these Sharks junior players are playing, but it's not as easy to just say, oh, well, let's just check out this particular OHL team that happens to house every single Sharks prospect. No, they're scattered around different leagues around the world, and so let's kind of aggregate them all here together to give this particular update. Another thing you'll notice is that the first round pick for the San Jose Sharks of the 2021 draft, William Eklund, is not on this list for a couple of reasons. The first being that he did play NHL games this season, so I wouldn't necessarily still consider him a massive prospect. He kind of was good enough to make the team, the Sharks just wanting to delay his entry-level deal. Second of all, he really hasn't played that many games in Sweden because he started with the NHL. He's played 9 games. He's got 5 assists during that time, and on top of that, he is with the worst team in the SHL. Plus, he's heading over to the World Juniors now to play for Sweden, so we're going to get even less games for him at the SHL level. So I thought it'd just be more interesting to update some of the more consistently playing junior players of the past 2 seasons for the Sharks. And starting off at the top of this list is the first round pick from 2020, Ozzy Weisblatt. Now, while the Sharks were one of the worst teams in 2020 because they did not have a first-round pick that year, they ended up acquiring one from the Tampa Bay Lightning at the trade deadline in exchange for Barclay Goodro. Now, unfortunately, the Lightning would end up winning the Stanley Cup that season, and as such, this first-round pick would end up being last in the first round, and with that, they'd end up taking Weisblatt. Weisblatt did play and participate in development camp as well as the rookie tournament face-off earlier this season. He looked pretty good at times, though I wouldn't say consistently good. Pretty enigmatic, decently speedy player with some nice passing, but nothing insane, and certainly didn't look like a player who was poised to try and make it to the main Sharks roster for this upcoming season. So he would be returning to juniors as a draft +2 player to play in the WHL, and in his time there, 26 games played, 7 goals, which is a bit low, 16 assists, and 23 points. You're likely expecting a bit more dominance from Weisblatt as a former first-round pick, playing in juniors leagues 2 years after his draft year, but, you know, not necessarily the end of the world, I guess you could say, for Weisblatt, especially when you consider the fact that he's on one of the worst WHL teams in that league. He's with the Prince Albert Raiders. He does still lead his team in terms of points by a decently wide margin of 5 points. So he's leading the way. He's doing what he can, but because he's on a bad team, maybe the point totals come down a bit. So I wouldn't be super disappointed, but I am looking forward to see once Weisblatt does make that transition to the actual pro leagues of the AHL next season, or potentially even the NHL. You never really know how he actually performs there. Next on the list is Thomas Bordeleau. Was drafted only a few spots below Weisblatt in the 2020 draft because, of course, the Sharks had a very early first-round pick. They just ended up losing that in the Erik Karlsson trade, so the second-round pick that they did have was also very, very early, and so Bordeleau was drafted pretty borderline, no pun intended there. player from the first round. He could have definitely gone right near the end of the first round, but instead was an early second round pick. And Bordelot has been very impressive, not playing in the CHL, so no WHL, OHL, or QMJHL hockey for him. Instead, playing in college in the NCAA. The team he's on, Michigan, has been doing very well this season, but of course, Bordelot has been a bit overshadowed by some of his teammates. For those who may not know, he is joined by Owen Powers, the first overall pick from the 2021 draft. The NHL draft, the second overall pick from the 2021 draft, Matty Beignets, and the fourth overall pick from the 2021 entry draft, Luke Hughes. So Bordelot definitely a bit overshadowed in the general public eye, but his skills were still very appreciated. He was actually invited to the World Juniors USA hockey camp for the upcoming 2022 World Juniors tournament. Unfortunately, Bordelot has not had the best of luck with World Juniors situations. It was just last year that it looked like he was going to be able to make the US team for that 2021 tournament, but unfortunately his roommate ended up getting a positive COVID test, so he was not able to participate. This season it looked like he was going to have an even bigger role for the United States this particular year, a top 6 offensive role, but unfortunately this time he himself came down with COVID, so again having to set that out, and this was his final possible year to participate in the World Juniors, because that is of course an under 20 tournament, and he's going to be turning 20 at some point in the next few months. And as such, he's never really gotten this opportunity to show his performances on the biggest stage for some of these younger players. So it'll be interesting to see how Bordelot progresses with kind of missing out on those opportunities. He has 18 games played, 6 goals, 13 assists for 19 points on that very stacked Michigan team. And I think one of the main interesting things for Bordelot will actually be how he does next season. I suspect he may make the transition to pro leagues, but I wouldn't be surprised if he actually ends up staying in college. And considering the fact that players like Owen Powers, Matty Beignets, and Luke Hughes will likely end up making that transition because of the fact that they were very highly drafted players of this past year's draft, Bordelot will kind of be the guy to look at for that particular team, and it'll definitely be very interesting to see how he performs if that ends up being the case, even if we don't actually ever end up seeing him at World Juniors level. Next is Tristan Robbins, also drafted as a second-round pick in the 2020 draft. He had started this junior season kind of like a house on fire, slowed down slightly, but still doing very, very well for himself. 28 games played, 12 goals, 22 assists for 34 points. That actually does not lead his team in terms of points. There is a player right above him with 36, but still rather impressive performance for Tristan Robbins, a player who during the rookie development camp and rookie face-off tournament, I wasn't necessarily blown away by. He didn't necessarily catch my eye in really many of the games that he did play, but it's nice to see him performing at the junior level, obviously, and we'll see how things go come next year for himself. Next is Danil Gushchin, who has been having a pretty successful junior year. 22 games played, 17 goals and 12 assists for 29 points. Those numbers already look pretty solid, 29 points in 22 games. But when you put it into perspective of the fact that the team he plays for, the Niagara Ice Dogs, are dead last in the OHL, and the fact that he leads the team by a very wide margin of, I believe, 7 or 8 points in terms of point scoring, it's very clear that that team that is last place in the league leans so heavily on Gushchin, and he's been doing a very good job of trying to get any sort of offense generated for them. Obviously, it's kind of weird to say he's been doing a good job considering the team is still losing a lot of games, but as we know from just every level of hockey, if your team is losing games, it becomes much more difficult to actually just consistently put up points, right? Unless you're McDavid, who's able to put up 100 points while the Oilers are missing the playoffs, your point totals are indeed going to suffer playing on a bad team, and that's exactly what happened here for Gushchin. The kind of interesting thing for Gushchin is the fact that he actually is not going to be heading to the World Junior Tournament coming up in the next few weeks for Team Russia. For whatever reason, he ends up getting snubbed in that regard. Kind of one of the biggest snubs, not only for Team Russia, but just generally in the entire tournament. Players like Brandt Clark ended up getting snubbed for Team Canada, and Gushchin is definitely not right up there, but trailing slightly behind in terms of a snub list for Team Russia. So that was a bit of a surprise. We won't be able to see him at the highest level, the big World Juniors tournament, but still nice season for him at the OHL level. Next, we will arrive here at Brandon Coe, a 4th round pick in the 2020 draft, and a name that a lot of people have been talking about in the Sharks, fandom, because of the fact that he does currently lead the OHL in terms of points. 29 games played, 18 goals, 34 assists for 52 points. That's first place in the OHL. And so a lot of people saying, wow, Brandon Coe is really coming out of nowhere and being one of these top prospects for the San Jose Sharks. You have William Eklund, and then you have Brandon Coe right behind. I'll kind of pump the brakes a bit there, and here's an opportunity which I usually do in some of these prospect update videos, which is to explain how these players usually work at the junior level. You see Brandon Coe being a 2020 draftee. This is in his draft plus 2 year in the OHL with the North Bay Battalion. And the thing is that Brandon Coe right now, he's not going to be at the World Juniors because he's already 20 years old. And he's 20 years old, he's 6'4", he's over 200 pounds, and he's playing against, 17 or even 16-year-old players who are much, much less physically developed than him. You take a look at a 3 or 4 year age difference at the NHL level, and it doesn't really seem like a big deal. A 28-year-old playing against a 25-year-old, you don't really care about that from age perspectives. You really only care about that between skill perspective. But that's not really the exact same thing that happens at the junior level, because the difference between a 20-year-old and a 16-year-old in terms of just bodily development physically is absolutely massive. So it's really not much of a surprise. Brandon Coe, especially a player of his stature physically, like I said, 6'4", over 200 pounds, is easily able to dominate the ice when he is on it, is just able to push other players, these much younger players, around and just kind of score goals and get points at will. I took a look at a lot of these other draft plus 2 players drafted in the same year. Yes, Weisblad, Robbins, and Gushin, they're all there, but they're still relatively smaller players, and so you wouldn't necessarily, if you were to just look at them, pick them out of a crowd and say, well, this guy's clearly older. But when it comes to Brandon Coe, a physically imposing type of player, you kind of can pick him out of a crowd and say, this guy's clearly much older than the players around him. So it's not a massive surprise that he is managing to lead his team in terms of points and, of course, lead the league in terms of points. Now, having said that, obviously the best case scenario that you can hope for a player, even if they are a draft plus 2 player, is to lead the league in points, right? You can't actually do any better than that. You can't be super leading the league in terms of points. I mean, I guess Coe is tied for the league lead, so you could say he could do better by having single-handedly the lead. However, you can't really do better than what Coe is currently doing, and so it's hard to really chastise him for that. Just to kind of, like I said, pump the brakes a bit. This is a situation where he's just so much more physically developed than everyone around him that it would almost be somewhat disappointing if he wasn't dominating the OHL currently. Having said that, he could still end up being a rather promising prospect. During the rookie face-off tournament, he actually had the honors of playing up at times in the lineup with William Eklund, so clearly the coaches thought decently well of Brandon Coe, and so we'll see how his career goes in the future. Next, we finally get to a 2021 draftee for the San Jose Sharks. That would be Gannon Larocque, the only defenseman on this list, and he's been having a rather solid season offensively at the very least. 26 games played, 4 goals, 18 assists for 22 points. That's good for second on his team in terms of scoring, and first in terms of defensive scoring on his team by a massively wide margin, almost triple the points of the next closest defenseman. And this is a pretty nice step forward for Larocque in his draft plus 1 year, because just last season in the WHL, in his 21 games played, he actually only had 7 points. So clearly a massive step forward for himself offensively, which is nice to see. Clearly being relied on quite significantly by his team, which is also not necessarily super high near the top of the WHL standings. So think of that, or make of that what you will. And finally, another 2021 draftee and the only goaltender on this list, that would be Benjamin Goodro. When he was drafted this past year in the 2021 draft, he was widely regarded as the third best goaltender in that draft after Wallstedt and Costa. Ends up going in the third round to the San Jose Sharks. 14 games played, 3.15 GAA and a .906 save percentage. Obviously, those stats don't look particularly appetizing if you're looking at it from an NHL level, but it's very important to remember that at the junior level, the goaltending stats end up getting very inflated because of the fact that juniors players are not necessarily known for their high quality defensive play. So while at the OHL level for forwards, you're usually kind of taking a look at them and saying, well, you expect those numbers to come down as they make it to the pro league. When it comes to the goaltenders, you actually expect the numbers to get better as it comes to the pro league because of the fact that the game won't be as wide open. To put things into perspective, a .906 save percentage, which would be below average at the NHL, actually has Goodro tied for 5th in terms of save percentage at the OHL level, meaning this is above average for an OHL goaltender. His 3.15 GAA, not so much. That finds him further down the list in terms of GAA for OHL goaltenders, but also to put things into perspective, the first place goaltender in terms of goals against average has a 2.48, which again is maybe slightly above average at the NHL level, and yet is the top mark at the OHL level. So just to give a bit of an update on Ben Goodro, this isn't to say that he's going to be ready next season. Obviously not. Goaltenders are notoriously known to take many years to develop. Even a player like Spencer Knight, who was drafted, I believe, in the first round by the Florida Panthers in the 2019 NHL entry draft, only ended up making his debut with the Panthers in the 2021 playoffs. So that would mean we would expect a debut for Goodro next year's playoffs. But that's also with Spencer Knight being the best goaltender in the draft that year, and Goodrow's only the 3rd best. So we probably shouldn't expect Goodro at least for another 2 to 3 years, and that's kind of bare minimum at this point. But that will do it for this prospect update. The Sharks prospect looking decently promising, obviously having some pretty solid years in juniors, nothing necessarily standing out significantly, right? Right now, it seems to be William Eklund leading the way in terms of the Sharks prospect pool. I would then probably have Thomas Bordeleau 2nd, and then it's kind of a guess who would actually be 3rd and how the rest of the rankings would come together. But as we know, with the Sharks kind of struggling, this past year, the past couple of years, and potentially even this year, depending on how the rest of this season goes, the Sharks prospect pool is only just beginning to get sort of restocked here. Class dismissed.